The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the place, it's the smell. It's the smell of stagnant water, of methane gas bubbling up from the muck, and something else, something sweet and metallic, like old pennies and rotting flowers. This is Blackwood Marsh. And the house, the one my family has owned for generations, sits right in the middle of it, like a decaying tooth in a diseased jaw. My name is Arthur Vance, and I hadn't been back in 20 years. Not since the summer my parents sent me away to boarding school, just weeks after my cousin Clara drowned in the bog. They said it was for a better education. I knew it was to get me away from the family sickness, as my mother called it. The melancholy that clung to the Vance line like the swamp mist clung to the cypress trees. Now, I was back. My great-uncle, Atticus, the last of the old guard, had died. He left me the house. He left me everything. The drive from the regional airport took 3 hours, the last of which was spent navigating a gravel road that seemed intent on rattling my rental car apart. The trees formed a canopy so thick that the afternoon sun was reduced to a sickly green twilight. When I finally broke through into the clearing, the house was worse than I remembered. It wasn't just old, it was sinking. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously to the left, its lowest edge already disappearing into the brackish water of the marsh. The wood, once white, was stained black with mildew and algae up to the second-floor windows. It listed to one side, a shipwrecked vessel half claimed by the earth. I parked on the only patch of solid ground, a small island of gravel, and stared. I was the sole inheritor of a moldering pile of timber that was actively trying to commit suicide by drowning. The lawyer, a nervous man named Fields from the nearest town, had already met me, handed me the keys, and practically sprinted back to his car. "Mr. Vance," he'd said, refusing to make eye contact, his briefcase held like a shield. "The will is clear. The property, the grounds, and all contents are yours. There is also a stipend. A significant one. Deposited monthly, contingent on your occupancy." Occupancy? I'd asked. "You mean I have to live here?" Fields had finally looked at me, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place. Pity? No, it was fear. "The will is very specific, Mr. Vance. The house cannot be left empty. A Vance must always be in residence. It's a condition of the trust. And if I refuse? Then the trust is dissolved, the property is seized by the county for environmental reclamation, and, well..." He'd hesitated. "Well, what?" "My grandfather handled your family's affairs before me," Fields said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He said the last time the house was left empty, back in '47. The singing started again. People in town got sick. Livestock died." He shook his head, looking ashamed of his own words. "Look, it's superstition, of course. But the stipend is generous. Just, stay in the house. And whatever you do, follow the instructions Atticus left." He'd thrust a small, leather-bound journal into my hand and fled. Now, standing in the humid air, keys in hand, I looked at the house. Singing. Right. The front door groaned in protest, the wood swollen thick with moisture. The inside was a time capsule of decay. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that penetrated the grime-caked windows. Furniture was draped in white sheets, looking like a congregation of silent ghosts. The air was heavy, still, and cold, despite the oppressive humidity outside. But the most unsettling thing? It was clean. There was no dust on the floorboards, no cobwebs in the corners. The sheets on the furniture were stiff and white, as if freshly laundered. Yet the house felt profoundly empty, abandoned not just by Atticus, but by time itself. I dropped my bags in the foyer. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deep inside. I found the journal Fields had given me in my jacket pocket. It was Atticus's hand, shaky but precise. The first page wasn't a welcome. It was a list of rules. Regulations for the keeper of Blackwood House. The house must never be silent. The phonograph in the study must play at all times between dusk and dawn. If it stops, rewind it immediately. Do not let the silence settle. All mirrors must be covered after dark. Do not, under any circumstances, look at your reflection in the hours of darkness. The salt lines at all thresholds, doors and windows, must be maintained. Check them daily. Use the black salt from the cellar, not common salt. If a line is broken, repair it before sunset. Do not venture onto the bog after dark. This is not a request, it is a law. The lights you see are not friendly. If you hear your name called from the marsh, it is not me. It is not anyone. Do not answer. Do not acknowledge it. Go to the study and turn up the volume on the phonograph. The cellar door must remain locked. The items within are for maintenance only. Curiosity is an invitation. I read the list 3 times. This was madness. My great-uncle hadn't just been eccentric, he'd been clinically paranoid. Melancholy. The family sickness. I spent the afternoon exploring, or rather, conducting reconnaissance. The house was a maze of dark rooms and heavy furniture. The kitchen was surprisingly modern, stocked with canned goods and supplies. The study, however, was the heart of the madness. A beautiful, old horn phonograph sat on a mahogany desk. Beside it, a stack of thick, black shellac records. There were no titles, just wax pencil numbers. True to the journal, a thick line of glittering black salt was poured meticulously across the windowsill. I found the cellar door off the kitchen. It was thick oak, reinforced with iron bands, and secured with a massive, ancient padlock. I felt a cold draft seeping from beneath it. As evening approached, a deep sense of unease settled over me. The house grew darker, the shadows stretching and deepening, seeming to crawl out from the corners. The silence, which had been peaceful, now felt heavy, suffocating. I remembered the first rule. The house must never be silent. Against my better judgment, I went to the study. I picked a record at random, placed it on the turntable, and cranked the handle. The needle hissed against the shellac, and then, music filled the house. It wasn't a melody. It was a drone. A low, vibrating, cello-like sound that seemed to thrum in my very bones. It was deeply unsettling, but it was sound. It broke the silence. I went to the living room, uncovered the large, gilt-framed mirror over the fireplace, and immediately wished I hadn't. My reflection stared back at me, pale and drawn in the dim light. But for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the man in the glass smile, even though my own lips hadn't moved. I threw the sheet back over it, my heart hammering. I checked the salt line at the front door. It was intact. The back door, also intact. I made a meager dinner of canned soup and settled in the study, the phonograph droning its mournful tune beside me. I tried to read, but the sound, combined with the oppressive atmosphere, made it impossible to concentrate. I must have dozed off, because I woke with a jolt, the book on my lap. The room was pitch black. And silent. My blood ran cold. The phonograph had stopped. I scrambled for my phone, fumbling for the flashlight app. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the phonograph. The record had finished. Do not let the silence settle. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to crank the handle, to restart the record. The silence in the house was no longer empty, it was waiting. It was heavy, pressing in on me, filling my ears with a pressure that was almost deafening. And then, from outside, I heard it. It wasn't a song. It was a sound. A low, resonant hum that started just below the threshold of hearing and slowly climbed. It sounded like a million voices humming a single, discordant note. It was coming from the bog. I backed away from the window, my eyes wide. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was in the house. It vibrated through the floorboards, through the soles of my shoes, making my teeth ache. It sings back. Do not listen. I frantically cranked the phonograph. The moment the needle dropped, the mechanical drone of the cello filled the room again. The sound from the bog didn't stop, but it was muffled. Pushed back, as if the two sounds were at war. I collapsed into the chair, breathing heavily, my entire body trembling. I stayed there until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. Only then did the humming from the bog finally fade, like a tide receding. Exhausted, terrified, and angry, I stood up. I was leaving. This was insane. No amount of money was worth this. I'd take my chances with the county and the reclamation. I stalked to the back door, ready to grab my bags and get in my car. I tore the sheet off the small mirror in the hallway, needing to see my own sane face in the daylight. I froze. The salt line at the back door was broken. A single, large, three-toed footprint was pressed into the spilled black salt on the floorboards, pointing into the kitchen. It was wet, glistening with black, oily mud from the bog. And from the cellar, beneath the massive, padlocked door, I heard a soft, wet thud. Like something heavy had just been dropped onto a stone floor. My first coherent thought was to run. To grab my bags, get in a rental car, and drive until the smell of mildew and old pennies was just a bad memory. The stipend be damned. The singing be damned. Let the county have the house, let them deal with whatever left that three-toed, oily track on the floorboards. But I was frozen, staring at the massive padlock on the cellar door. The thud had come from behind it. The footprint led towards it. But the lock was untouched. Ancient, heavy, and firmly closed. If the creature didn't open the door, how did it get in? I forced myself to move, my stocking feet sliding on the cold floor. I knelt, examining the print. It was larger than my hand. The mud it left behind was thick and black, and it carried that sweet, stomach-turning smell of rot and flowers. I followed the trail with my eyes. It started at the back door, where the salt line was broken, walked directly across the kitchen floor, and then, stopped. Right in front of the locked cellar door. It didn't go back. It just stopped. As if the creature had simply phased through the thick oak and iron. My gaze snapped back to the broken salt line. The salt lines must be maintained. Check them daily. Use the black salt from the cellar. I had to repair the line. Rule 3. Sunset was hours away, but I couldn't wait. The thought of that broken barrier was a physical itch under my skin. But the salt was in the cellar. And the cellar was locked. This was the trap. To obey Rule 3, I had to violate Rule 6, the cellar door must remain locked. I spent 10 minutes searching the kitchen, my hands shaking. The drawers were full of antique, rust-spotted cutlery, and yellowed linens. No key. It had to be in the study. The house was dreadfully silent. I'd turned off the phonograph at dawn, and now the quiet felt different. It felt listening. I walked quickly to the study, my eyes darting to the covered mirrors I passed. I refused to look at them. The study was just as I'd left it. I searched Atticus's desk. The drawers were filled with old maps of the marsh, tax documents, and small canvas pouches of the same black salt, but only small amounts. Not nearly enough to repair an entire threshold. Tucked under a blotter, I found the leather-bound journal. Not the one with the rules, but a ledger. I opened it. Atticus's shaky script filled the pages. It wasn't just a journal, it was a logbook. June 10th. The singing was loud tonight. The drone held it back. The salt line at the west window was thin, but held. It is restless. June 14th. Had to feed it. Used the last of the neighbor's goats. I paid him triple, told him it was coyotes. He knows better, but the money keeps him quiet. The town is safer this way, but the cost is high. July 2nd. Clara. She came to visit. I warned her not to wander. She heard it. She heard her name from the bog. I told her not to answer. I wasn't fast enough. The water took her. It was my fault. All my fault. My blood ran cold. My cousin Clara. Her drowning wasn't an accident. Atticus knew. He knew. July 10th. It is quiet. It is always quiet after a feeding. The house is secure. My stomach churned. Feed it? Atticus wasn't just keeping things out. He was keeping something in. I slammed the ledger shut, a new, sickening understanding dawning on me. I looked around the room, frantic. The key. Where was the key? My eyes landed on the phonograph. The one thing that needed constant attention. The one thing that had to be tended to every night. I ran my fingers under the heavy wooden base. Taped to the bottom, cold against my skin, was a single, massive iron key. I stood before the cellar door, the key heavy in my palm. The house was deathly still. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. I had to get the salt. I had to repair the barrier. I put the key in the padlock. It was stiff, protesting with a grinding shriek of metal. The lock sprung open. I slid the heavy bar back and pulled the door open. The smell that hit me was overpowering. The sweet rot, the metallic tang of pennies, and a powerful, sharp odor of ozone, like a lightning strike had happened right in the room. It was cold. A deep, wet cold that felt nothing like the humid air of the house. I turned on my phone's flashlight. Stone steps, slick with moisture, descended into absolute blackness. This wasn't a basement, it was a crypt. Salt, I whispered to myself, my voice sounding thin and dead in the oppressive air. Just get the salt and get out. I started down, one step at a time, my light beam dancing off the wet stone walls. This chamber was old, far older than the house. The house had been built on top of it. The air grew colder with every step until I could see my breath fogging in the beam. I reached the bottom. The floor was packed earth. The space was huge, a vaulted chamber that stretched away into darkness. Against the far wall, I saw what I was looking for, a stack of thick burlap sacks. I hurried over, my light sweeping across them. The stencil on the front read, "Black salt, for containment only." I fumbled in my pocket for the small canvas pouch Atticus kept in the desk. I ripped it open and began scooping the glittering black crystals into it. My hands were numb, clumsy. "Just a little more," I muttered, "just enough for the door." As I turned to leave, the beam of my light cut across the center of the chamber. I stopped. In the middle of the room was a wide, circular pool of perfectly still, black water. It wasn't a well, it looked like a spring, bubbling up from the earth itself. The oily, iridescent water glistened. And lying on the damp earth next to it was the source of the thud. It was a deer, or what was left of it. The carcass was massive, a 10-point buck, but it was torn almost in two. Its entrails were spooled out onto the ground, and one of its legs was missing, snapped off at the hip. It was fresh. Steam was still rising from the blood. My mind raced, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The footprint. The broken salt line. The deer. The creature didn't get into the cellar from the house. It lives in the cellar. It came up from that black pool, went out the back door to hunt, breaking the salt line in the process, and dragged its kill back inside, right past me as I slept. It dropped the deer here, causing the thud I heard. It was in the house. It was always in the house. A new, more terrifying thought slammed into me. If it was out hunting, where is it now? I spun, shining my light back at the stone steps. They were empty. I swept the light across the vast, dark chamber. Empty shelves. Empty corners. Then, my light hit the pool. The black water was no longer still. A ripple, slow and heavy, was spreading from the center. A single, large bubble rose to the surface and popped, releasing a fresh wave of that sickeningly sweet, metallic smell. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. I ran. I scrambled up the stone steps, slipping on the wet surfaces, the small pouch of salt clutched in my hand. I burst through the doorway into the kitchen, slammed the thick oak door shut, and fumbled with the iron bar. I got the bar seated. I snapped the padlock shut. I was safe. And then, from the other side of the door, came the slam. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a growl. It was a single, wet, body-wrecking impact, as if something of immense weight had thrown itself against the wood. The door shuddered in its frame. The iron hinges groaned. I fell back, crab-walking away until my back hit the kitchen cabinets. I stared at the door, at the fresh, oily mud that had splattered through the keyhole from the force of the impact. I was trapped in the house with this thing. And it knew I was here. I looked down at the pouch in my hand. I had to fix the salt line. I scrambled to the back door, meticulously cleaning the bog filth from the floor, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the scoop. I poured the new line of glittering black salt, my eyes constantly darting back to the cellar door. When I was done, I went back to the study. I grabbed Atticus's ledger and a pen. On a blank page, I wrote. 7. It lives in the cellar. It comes from the pool. It hunts at night. The salt does not keep it out. The salt keeps it contained. A horrifying realization settled over me. Atticus's rules were not to protect me from the marsh. They were to protect the things in the marsh from the thing in my cellar. The phonograph, Rule 1, kept the singing at bay. The salt lines, Rule 3, kept what? Other things out. And Rule 6, the cellar door must remain locked. Atticus wasn't protecting me from the cellar. He was protecting the creature in the cellar. I looked at the sky. Dusk was coming. The house would need its music. But as I stared at the locked cellar door, a new, dreadful question echoed in the silence. Atticus's log said, had to feed it. It had just eaten. But I was here now. And I had just locked it in. What was I supposed to do when it got hungry again? The slam against the cellar door echoed in my bones. I scrambled back, my breath hitching in my throat, the small pouch of black salt clutched in my fist. The door shuddered again, and a low, guttural growl vibrated through the wood. It was no longer just an animalistic sound, it was a sound of pure, intelligent rage. I didn't wait for a third slam. I ran. I fled the kitchen, abandoning the idea of cleaning the muddy footprint. I could still smell it, that coppery, floral rot. I burst into the foyer just as the last sliver of the sun vanished behind the black cypress trees of the marsh. The house plunged into a deep, oppressive twilight. And as if on cue, the singing began. It was the same low, resonant hum I'd heard last night, rising from the bog. It wasn't a melody, but a vibration that pressed against the house, making the windows rattle in their frames. It was a sound that wanted to be let in. My heart seized. Rule 1. The house must never be silent. I sprinted to the study, my feet pounding on the old wooden floors. The humming from the marsh seemed to follow me, seeping through the walls. It felt like the house itself was a drum, and something outside was beating on it. I reached the study, my hands fumbling for the phonograph. I cranked the handle, the mechanical winding sounding obscenely loud in the growing din. I dropped the needle on the record. The mournful, droning cello music flooded the room. Immediately, the pressure in my ears eased. The two sounds, the humming from the marsh and the drone from the phonograph, collided in the air, creating a discordant, nauseating harmony. It was a war of sounds, and the music was my only shield. I collapsed into Atticus's chair, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I was trapped. I couldn't leave the house. Rule 4, do not venture onto the bog after dark. And I was locked inside with it. My eyes fell on the ledger I'd left on the desk. I had to know more. I had to understand what my great-uncle had been doing. I lit the desk lamp, pulled the heavy book towards me, and forced myself to read. I flipped past the entries I'd already seen, my eyes scanning the shaky script. August 19th. The black salt arrived from the supplier. 300 pounds. It must be consecrated salt, the common kind is just seasoning. The lines must be maintained. They do not keep her in. They keep the others out. They are drawn to her. They answer her song. The music breaks the harmony, confuses them. My blood ran colder. The salt wasn't to keep the creature in the cellar. It was to keep other things out of the house. The creature in my cellar. Her, was calling to them. The singing was her song. I kept reading, my dread growing with every page. September 3rd. She is restless. The goat was not enough. The pool is agitated. She knows the townsfolk are near. She can smell them. The music is the only thing that calms the others, but it angers her. October 29th. I've failed. Clara. My Clara. She heard the song from the water. I told her it was just the wind, but she knew. She said it was beautiful. She went to the bog. My mind flashed to the entry I'd seen before, the water took her. I had assumed it was the marsh. The bog. But my eyes drifted back to the entry from May 1st, the one I had only glimpsed before. May 1st. I saw her face in the pool today. Just for a moment. Not the monster, but my Clara. My little girl. She smiled at me. I am lost. I will feed her whatever she asks. The pool. Not the bog. The black, oily pool in the cellar. A horrifying, impossible thought began to form. I grabbed another journal, one of the older ones, and frantically searched for entries about my family. April 4th, 1998. My sister brought her children to visit. Arthur and his twin, Clara. Such bright, happy children. Little Clara loves the marsh. She says she hears music. I have warned them to stay away from the water. And especially from the cellar. It was my cousin. My cousin Clara. The girl who supposedly drowned. Atticus's log said, the water took her. Then, I saw her face in the pool. He hadn't fed Clara to the creature. The creature was Clara. The house was silent, save for the competing drones of the phonograph and the marsh. I stared at the study wall, my mind trying to reject what I was reading. It was impossible. Clara was dead. We'd had a funeral. A closed casket, they'd said. Because of the water. Thump. I froze. The sound came from the kitchen. From the cellar door. Thump. 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 It wasn't the violent, enraged slam from before. This was different. It was soft. Rhythmic. Patient. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly on the floor. The thumping stopped. I held my breath. The phonograph droned on. The bog hummed. And then, a new sound, cutting through the cacophony. It was a voice, and it was coming from the cellar door. A small, thin voice. A little girl's voice. Arthur. I clapped my hands over my mouth, my whole body shaking. Arthur, are you out there? The voice called, muffled by the thick oak. It's so dark in here. Papa Atticus always let me out by now. I backed away, stumbling over an ottoman. Please, Arthur, the small voice wavered, turning into a desperate, thin whine. Papa Atticus promised he'd send someone. He promised. The voice was punctuated by another soft, pleading thump against the door. "I'm hungry, Arthur. I'm so hungry." I was paralyzed. The voice from the cellar wasn't just a mimic, it was a memory. "Arthur, please," it pleaded, the voice cracking with a perfect simulation of a 10-year-old's terror. "Papa Atticus locked me in the dark. He does that when I'm bad." "But I wasn't bad, Arthur. I promise." Thump. Thump. A soft, small fist, barely making the heavy door vibrate. I stayed in the study, my back pressed against the bookshelf, my knuckles white as I gripped the ledger. The phonograph's drone was a thin, brittle wall against the sound. "Do you remember the treehouse?" the voice whispered, and my blood turned to ice. "The one by the creek? You fell. You cut your knee, right here." I unconsciously touched the faint, silvery scar just below my left kneecap, a relic of a summer 20 years gone. "I helped you," the voice continued, its tone now intimate, conspiratorial, as if it were whispering right in my ear. "I got the bandages. I helped you, Arthur. Now you have to help me. It's your turn. Let me out." "No," I whispered, the word dry in my throat. "You're not Clara." The pleading stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Even the humming from the bog seemed to pause. The phonograph played its lonely, grating tune. Then, the real sound returned. Slam. A furious, wet, heavy impact that shook the entire house. The phonograph needle skipped, letting out a horrific screech before settling back into its groove. Slam. Slam. This was not a child. This was the beast. The thing that had torn a deer in half. It was losing patience. A new sound began. A long, sharp, scraping. The sound of metal dragging slowly, deliberately, across the inside of the oak door. Scree. It set my teeth on edge, a primal, invasive noise designed to flay the nerves. I had to move. I couldn't stay in the study. I needed to check the rest of the house. I needed to check the salt lines. I ran from the study, down the short hall to the main foyer. The scraping sound followed me, echoing through the house. I checked the front door. The line of black salt was intact. Thank God. I moved into the grand, decaying living room. The phonograph's music was fainter here, and the humming from the marsh was stronger, pressing against the tall, grime-caked windows. And I realized my mistake. The large, gilt-framed mirror over the fireplace. Yesterday, I had thrown the sheet back over it. Now, the sheet lay crumpled on the floor, pooled like a shroud. Rule 2. All mirrors must be covered after dark. I stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at my own reflection in the dim light. I looked pale, terrified, my eyes wide. I willed myself to move, to turn away, to go find the sheet. But I couldn't. Because as I stood there, watching, my reflection blinked. I hadn't. I took a sharp, sudden breath. My reflection remained perfectly still, its chest not moving. It stared back at me, and then, very slowly, it smiled. It was a wide, wet smile, and it wasn't mine. My heart hammered against my ribs as I took a stumbling step backward. My reflection leaned forward, its face seeming to press against the glass from the inside. Its features began to blur, to run like watercolor. The face elongated, the skin turning a pale, grayish white. Its eyes dissolved into two large, luminous, empty orbs. It was no longer my reflection. It was a tall, gaunt figure, draped in what looked like wet, black river weeds. It raised a long, skeletal hand and placed it flat against the glass. The glass of the mirror rippled, like the surface of a pond. The thing was coming through. I screamed, a raw, choked sound, and scrambled backward, tripping over a footstool and crashing to the floor. The apparition stepped out of the mirror. It didn't make a sound. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It dripped black water onto the antique rug, and the smell of the bog, the smell of the others, filled the room, overwhelming the stench of the cellar. It turned its head, its movements slow and jointed, like a heron. It looked at me, its luminous eyes devoid of all reason. And then it opened its mouth. No sound came out. But the humming from the bog instantly quadrupled in volume, shaking the very foundations of the house. The windows bowed inward, the glass groaning under the pressure. The others were answering its call. Slam! 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 From the kitchen, the cellar door sounded like it was being hit with a battering ram. The creature I knew as Clara was in a frenzy, howling with a deep, territorial rage. The apparition from the mirror ignored me. It turned its gaunt head, its gaze fixed on the doorway leading to the kitchen. It seemed to be listening to the assault on the cellar. I was trapped. Trapped between the monster that wanted to get out, and the monster that had just gotten in. The house was a war zone of sound. Clara's furious, heavy slams against the cellar door were a brutal rhythm section. The phonograph's drone was a thin, defiant wail. And overlaying it all was the overwhelming, invasive hum from the bog, amplified by the gaunt apparition standing in the living room. I was still on the floor, my mind screaming. The creature from the mirror, dripping black bog water onto the priceless rug, took a slow, gliding step. Its movements were fluid and unnatural, like a length of kelp pulled by an unseen tide. It was not moving toward me. It was moving toward the kitchen. Toward her. It recognized a rival. This was my only chance. Pushing myself backward with my heels, I crab-walked away from the confrontation, my eyes locked on the two epicenters of the madness. The mirror creature's back was to me as it faced the kitchen doorway. The cellar door, visible down the short hall, vibrated violently. Slam! Slam! Screech! Clara was no longer just pounding, she was clawing. The sound of her talons dragging across the iron-banded oak was the sound of pure, territorial fury. The mirror creature stopped. It tilted its head, listening. Then, it responded. It raised its head and emitted a sound that was nothing like the bog's hum. It was a high, thin, piercing shriek, like the sound of a microphone feeding back inside a wet cave. It was a challenge. The effect on the house was immediate and catastrophic. The humming from the bog, which had already quadrupled, instantly intensified, becoming a physical force that shook the walls. The living room windows, which had been bowing inward, didn't just rattle. They exploded. Crash! A tidal wave of glass and frigid night air blasted into the room. I threw my arms over my face, the sound of the shattering windows mixing with the creature's shriek. The mirror creature paused, turning its head with that slow, heron-like movement. Its luminous, empty orbs swept the room, passing over my form on the floor as if I were just another piece of broken furniture. It was distracted. In the kitchen, the assault on the cellar door reached its climax. I heard a sound that wasn't just a slam, it was the sharp, deafening crack of splintering timber. The iron hinges screamed as they were torn from the frame. The mirror creature, sensing the breach, glided with horrifying speed toward the kitchen doorway. This was it. I scrambled to my feet and bolted, not toward the kitchen, but back toward the foyer. I ran past the sheet-draped furniture, my feet slipping on the rug now slick with the creature's bog water. I reached the foyer, the front door and freedom just 10 feet away. My hands, slick with cold sweat, fumbled for the deadbolt. I heard it before I saw it. A roar, deep and wet and filled with impossible lung power, bellowed from the kitchen as the cellar door was finally thrown from its hinges. The mirror creature shrieked in answer. I didn't look back. I yanked the front door open, pulling it inward, ready to escape into the relative safety of the night. I froze on the threshold, the cold bog air hitting my face. The night was no longer safe. It was no longer dark. Rule 4. Do not venture onto the bog after dark. The lights you see are not friendly. The bog was alive. Where there had been only darkness, there were now lights. Dozens of them. Pale, luminous, sickly green orbs, just like the eyes of the mirror creature, bobbing and weaving through the cypress trees. They weren't distant. They were close. And they were all moving, in a silent, horrifying procession, toward the house. They were answering the call. I heard a crash from the living room behind me, the sound of the heavy oak fireplace mantel being torn from the wall. The fight had begun. I looked at the army of others gliding toward me from the marsh, then back into the darkness of the house, where the two titans were tearing the world apart. I slammed the front door shut, throwing the deadbolt. I was locked in. My back pressed against the door, I stared down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. The phonograph's drone was now hopelessly lost beneath a symphony of inhuman shrieks, guttural roars, and the sound of my family home being splintered, piece by piece. I was wrong. I wasn't locked in. The house was unlocked, breached, and the war had just arrived. I stayed pressed against the front door for only a second, my mind racing. The foyer was dark, but the living room, to my left, was now flickering with an unholy, sickly green light. I heard the tinkle of glass. I risked a look around the corner, peering into the living room. The fight was a blur of violence. Clara, a massive, three-toed silhouette of muscle and rage, was roaring, her claws tearing fistfuls of plaster from the walls as she lunged at the tall, gaunt mirror creature. The mirror creature was fluid and fast, shrieking its high-pitched challenge as it glided just out of her reach. But they were no longer the only occupants. Through the shattered bay windows, the others were coming. They were exactly as Atticus's journal described, they answer her song. They were the bog lights, the pale, luminous orbs I'd seen from the door. Now, they were gliding into the room, silent as smoke, drawn by the chaos. They weren't attacking, they were gathering. They were an audience, a congregation, and their combined presence made the humming in the air so powerful I felt it rattling my teeth. A massive crash shook the house as Clara picked up a sheet-draped armchair and hurled it. The chair passed through the mirror creature's torso, shattering against the far wall. The apparition recoiled, its form dissolving into a column of black, swirling weeds for a moment before snapping back into its tall, skeletal shape. It was time to go. The others were beginning to drift out of the living room, filling the foyer like a slow-moving tide of green light. They ignored me, flowing past me, all drawn to the battle. The stairs were my only option. I lunged for the main staircase, taking the steps two at a time, my boots echoing on the wood. The house felt like it was tearing itself apart. I didn't look back. I reached the second-floor landing, my lungs burning, and risked one look down. The entire foyer was now a river of glowing green orbs, all flowing silently toward the living room. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the marsh. But I wasn't safe. As I watched, a few of the orbs detached from the main flow and began to drift, slowly and curiously, up the stairs. They weren't rushing me. They weren't attacking. They were simply ascending. Filling the space. I turned and ran down the upstairs hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the ghastly green glow rising from the staircase behind me. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed. My old room. My parents' room. Clara's room. I ran to the very end of the hall, to the last door. Atticus's bedroom. It felt the most fortified, the most removed from the chaos. I threw the door open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut, twisting the old-fashioned skeleton key in the lock. I leaned against the door, my body screaming with terror and exhaustion, listening. The sounds from downstairs were slightly muffled now, the roars, the shrieks, the crashing. But they were soon joined by a new, terrifyingly close sound. A soft, wet, gliding noise. Right outside the bedroom door. I backed away, my eyes wide in the dark. And then I saw it. A pale, sickly green light began to seep from under the crack in the door, pulsing in time with the horrible humming from the bog. The others had followed me. They were outside, waiting. And the light was already pouring in. I scrambled backward from the door, my hip slamming hard against the leg of Atticus's heavy oak bed. The green light was no longer just a sliver, it was a pulsing, sickly glow that illuminated the floor, casting the shadows of the furniture into monstrous shapes. The gliding sound outside the door stopped. In its place, a soft, wet, probing sound began, concentrated at the keyhole. It was followed by a faint, metallic click. They were trying to open the door. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. There was only the door and one large window. Rule 3. The salt lines must be maintained. I lunged for the window, which was covered by thick, velvet curtains. If the others were coming in under the door, they could just as easily come through the window. I grabbed the curtains and ripped them aside, desperate to check the salt line on the sill. The salt line was there. Thick, black, and unbroken. But I barely registered it. Because I wasn't looking at the marsh. The window no longer overlooked the bog. Outside the glass, there was no night, no trees, no ground. There was only a swirling, endless, pitch-black void. And suspended within that void, like galaxies in a dead universe, were thousands upon thousands of those same pale, green, luminous orbs. They were drifting, pulsing, watching. The window wasn't a window, it was a viewport. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The house wasn't just on the marsh. It was somehow between places. Click. Rattle. Click. The sound from the hallway was more frantic. Something was intelligently manipulating the lock. The knob itself began to jiggle violently. I was out of time. I needed a weapon. I needed anything. I ran to Atticus's nightstand, yanking the drawer open. Old cough drops, a pair of reading glasses, a rosary. Nothing. I slammed it shut and pulled the bottom drawer. It was stuck. I tore at it, adrenaline surging, and the flimsy wood bottom ripped out, spilling its contents onto the floor. It wasn't just junk. There was another book. It was small, bound in black leather, and cold to the touch. A single silver clasp held it shut. I tore the clasp open. Tucked inside the front cover was a photograph. It was old, black and white, but the image was horrifyingly clear. Two figures stood in the cellar, in front of the black, oily pool. One was a man I recognized as a much younger Atticus. He was smiling, but his eyes were dark and grim. His hand rested on the shoulder of the other figure. The tall, gaunt, mirror creature. They weren't fighting. They weren't rivals. They were posing, side by side, like partners. The mirror creature's skeletal hand was raised, as if in greeting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the first page of the journal. Atticus's handwriting, but not the shaky script of an old man. This was the firm, precise hand of someone younger. September 1st, 1998. The pact is renewed. The keeper, Arthur Vance, provides the vessel. The Sentinel, the gaunt one, guards the crossing. The others must be appeased. September 4th, 1998. Clara is the chosen vessel. She is strong. She loves the music. She will serve the house well. I read the words again. Provides the vessel. Clara is the chosen vessel. This wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't an accident. It was a sacrifice. Atticus hadn't just let Clara be taken. He had given her to the pool. The creature in the cellar wasn't some horrifying corruption of Clara. It was Clara, transformed into a monstrous anchor. The battle downstairs, it wasn't a fight. It was a ritual. The mirror creature, the Sentinel, wasn't attacking Clara. It was something else. Testing her. Feeding her. Click. The sound from the hall was sharp, final. The rattling stopped. I looked up from the journal, my blood like ice. The knob on Atticus's bedroom door began to turn, slowly, deliberately, pushed by a force from the other side. The pale green light from the hallway flooded the room as the door began to creak open. The door swung inward with a mournful, scraping groan. The pale green light poured into the room, thick as fog, pushing the shadows into sharp, unnatural angles. The light wasn't just light, it was cold. I could feel it on my skin, a clammy, tomb-like chill. I was pressed against the far wall, the small black journal clutched to my chest. The doorknob, now free, was held in the grip of something. It wasn't a hand. It was a cluster of the green orbs, coalesced into a manipulative shape. The others began to flow into the room. They moved not like individual beings, but like a single, gaseous entity. A river of silent, pulsing green lights that glided across the floor, over the bed, and up the walls, ignoring me completely. Their presence brought the full, overwhelming stench of the bog, the smell of methane and deep, wet earth, and the humming sound intensified until it was a single, resonating bass note that shook my vision. I was irrelevant. I was furniture. I was just another object in the room they were claiming. They were not drawn to me. They were drawn to the book in my hand. One orb, then 3, then a dozen, broke from the main flow and hovered in the air directly in front of me. They didn't attack. They simply pulsed, their cold light illuminating the journal. They were waiting for me to open it. My hands were numb, my mind a blank slate of terror. I was no longer the keeper. I was a terrified trespasser who had stumbled into a sacred place. Crash! A sound from downstairs, so violent it felt as if the house's spine had snapped. A floor-to-ceiling china cabinet, perhaps. It was followed by Clara's deep, bellowing roar, a sound of triumph. The others in the room pulsed erratically, the harmony of their humming breaking for a moment. They seemed agitated, distracted. Then, a new figure filled the doorway. It was the Sentinel. The mirror creature. It glided into the room, its tall, gaunt form parting the river of green orbs like a ship's bow through water. It was undamaged, immaculate. The fight downstairs hadn't been a fight at all, it had been an unleashing. The Sentinel stopped in the center of the room. It raised one of its long, skeletal, weed-draped arms. It didn't make a sound. Instantly, every green orb in the room, the ones hovering before me, the ones clinging to the ceiling, froze. Then, in a single, silent, coordinated movement, they flowed backward. They streamed out the open door, down the hallway, and cascaded down the main staircase, a silent, spectral waterfall of green light. They were obedient. The humming from the bog receded, the pressure in the house dropping, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant, satisfied growl from Clara, now prowling the wreckage of the living room below. I was alone. Alone in the dark room with the Sentinel. It turned its head, that slow, unnatural, heron-like motion. Its luminous, empty orbs fixed on me. It glided forward, closing the distance between us until it towered over me, blocking out the light from the hall. This was the end. I squeezed my eyes shut, the journal held tight. A dry, rattling sound filled the air, like dead leaves skittering across a stone floor. I opened my eyes. The Sentinel's head was tilted. It was speaking. "You are the keeper." The voice was a chorus of whispers, 1,000 dry echoes speaking as one. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. It pointed one long, bony, dripping finger at the black journal in my hand. "You have read the pact." I could only nod, my throat locked in fear. "The vessel is unchained," it rattled. "She has fed." It paused, as if processing. "The ritual is complete. She is pacified." The deer. The fight. It wasn't a fight, it was a post-meal celebration. A claiming of territory. The Sentinel's gaze drifted to the window, to the void of stars and pulsing green lights beyond. The crossing is stable. For now. Its head snapped back to me, the movement jarringly fast. But she will hunger again. Fed. I finally choked out, the word sounding small and stupid. Atticus, he fed her. Goats? The Sentinel's empty orb seemed to narrow. The house provides. The keeper provides. She is Vance. She prefers warm blood. It glided back, a silent, 6-foot shadow. The others are soothed, it whispered. The sun is rising. Your duties begin, Arthur Vance. It knew my name. The Sentinel turned and, without a sound, glided from the room, disappearing into the dark hallway. I remained on the floor for a full minute, my mind completely shattered. The house was finally, truly silent. The roaring, the humming, the scraping, the phonograph, all of it was gone. Numbly, I got to my feet. I walked out of Atticus's room, down the hall, and to the landing. The house was a catastrophe. The foyer was ankle-deep in shattered glass from the windows and black, oily bog water, tracked in by the others. I walked down the stairs. The living room was unrecognizable. The furniture was splintered into kindling. The massive, gilt-framed mirror was a jagged, empty hole in the wall. I continued into the kitchen. The cellar door was gone. Where the thick, iron-banded door had been, there was now only a gaping black maw, the frame shattered and torn from the wall. The splintered remains of the door lay in pieces across the kitchen floor, mixed with the damp, black mud from the cellar. I approached the opening, my phone's flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. Clara. I whispered. Silence. The stone steps were slick with fresh, dark blood. The carcass of the deer was gone. The black pool was still. She was down there. Sated. Waiting. I looked at the devastation around me. At the broken salt line by the back door. At the ledger in my hand. I finally understood. I was not a prisoner. I was not an inheritor. I was a zookeeper. And the only animal in my charge was a monster that wore my cousin's face. The sun was rising. My duties had begun. I needed to find a new door. I needed to find more black salt. And, God help me, I needed to find a goat. The sun rose, mocking me. It sent shafts of buttery, golden light through the shattered living room windows, illuminating a scene of absolute desolation. The light did not make the horror recede, it only highlighted the details. The floor was a treacherous soup of black bog water, shattered glass, splintered antique wood, and plaster dust. The air was thick with the combined stench of the bog's methane and Clara's metallic, floral rot. The priceless rug was a ruined tapestry of mud and slime. The others, and the Sentinel, were gone, retreated with the dawn. I walked, my boots crunching on the glass, toward the kitchen. The devastation was centered there. The cellar entrance was a jagged, splintered maw in the floor. The heavy oak door had been reduced to kindling, thrown across the room as if by a bomb. One of the iron hinges was embedded in the far wall, buried 6 inches deep in the plaster. I approached the hole, my heart a cold stone in my chest. Clara. I called down, my voice hoarse. The darkness was absolute. The cold, damp air rose to meet me, but it was still. There was no growl, no whisper, no soft thudding. She was down there, sated and sleeping, digesting her kill. I backed away, my entire body shaking with a delayed reaction. I was alive. I had survived. And I was in charge. I stumbled to the study, the one room that had been spared the physical violence. The phonograph sat silent. The ledgers were on the desk. I collapsed into Atticus's chair, the small black journal still in my hand. The keeper provides. She will hunger again. I was the keeper. This was my pact now, whether I'd signed it or not. My duties were clear, and they were non-negotiable. First, containment. I couldn't live in a house with a gaping, unguarded hole leading to a monster. Second, protection. The others had been drawn by the chaos, but the journal was clear, they were always drawn to her song. The salt lines at every window and door were my first and only defense against the outside. Every single one of them, save for the front door and the study, was now breached by shattered glass or bog filth. They had to be repaired before sunset. Third, and most horrifying, sustenance. She will hunger again. Atticus's log was a grocery list of livestock. That was my job now. I wasn't just a zookeeper. I was the feeder. I looked at my watch. 7:30 a.m. I had maybe 12 hours until dusk. I forced myself to move. I grabbed the keys to the rental car, a wad of cash from Atticus's desk drawer, and the now empty canvas pouch. I went back to the kitchen, to the edge of the black void. I took a deep breath, held it, and plunged my phone's flashlight into the darkness. I'm coming down for the salt, I announced to the silence. Just the salt. There was no reply. I descended the wet stone steps, my light sweeping the chamber. The black pool was still. The air was heavy. The only sign of the night's events was the complete and total absence of the deer carcass. There wasn't a bone, not a drop of blood. She was a meticulous eater. The burlap sacks of black salt were against the far wall. I filled the pouch, my back to the pool, every nerve ending screaming. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was a physical weight. I didn't look back. I just filled the bag, turned, and walked. I did not run, back up the steps. I didn't bother trying to secure the broken frame. I just pushed a heavy, waterlogged sideboard in front of the opening. It was a pathetic barrier, but it was all I could do for now. The drive to town was a surreal, jarring transition. I left the gravel road, the canopy of dead trees, and the sinking, stinking house, and emerged into a bright, sunny morning. Cars passed me, people driving to work, sipping coffee, listening to the radio. They had no idea that just miles away, I was driving a car full of bog mud and shattered glass, on my way to buy supplies to imprison a god. The hardware store in town was small, the proprietor a weather-beaten man in overalls. "Mornin'," he grunted, looking me over. "You're Atticus's boy, ain't you? Heard you took over the old Vance place." "Just. Arthur." "His grandnephew," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Figured. Place needs a hell of a lot of work. Atticus let it go real bad at the end. Got strange. What can I get for you?" "I need lumber. Thick plywood, 3/4 inch. 4x8 sheets." "How many?" "6. And 2x4s. And, the biggest, heaviest padlock you have. And lag bolts. Long ones." The man whistled. "Buildin' a damn fortress, are ya?" "Something like that," I muttered. An hour later, the rental car's suspension was groaning under the weight of the lumber, which was strapped precariously to the roof. My next stop was harder. I drove out of town, following signs for livestock auctions. I found a small farm with a hand-painted sign by the road, "Goats for sale, meat and brush." A woman in a sun hat came out to meet me, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I help you?" I'd like to buy a goat," I said, feeling like a ghoul. "For milk? Or for meat?" "Just, for brush. At the old Vance place. The bog is, reclaiming the yard." She nodded, understanding. "You'll want a big one, then." A weather. Got a feisty one named Billy that'll eat anything, including the clothes off your line if you let him. 10 minutes and $200 in cash later, I was driving back to the marsh. The lumber was strapped to the roof, the heavy lock and bolts were on the passenger seat, and in the back, the goat was bleeding, its protests filling the car with a sound that was, under the circumstances, unbearable. I got back with 3 hours to spare. The work was frantic. First, the salt. I meticulously cleaned every single shattered window frame, pulling out the shards of glass. Then I poured a thick, unbroken line of the black crystals across every single sill, every single threshold. Then, the cellar. I moved the sideboard, my muscles straining. I built a crude, heavy frame of 2x4s inside the cellar's broken doorway. I drilled into the stone, my hands aching, and seated the lag bolts. Then I muscled the heavy plywood sheets into place, creating a new, ugly, but solid door. I attached the heavy hasp and snapped the massive padlock shut. It was done. The house was sealed. As I hammered the last bolt home, the sun touched the horizon. Dusk. The house was still. The bog was still. I realized with a jolt that I had forgotten. The phonograph. I ran to the study. The house was silent. Too silent. The humming from the bog hadn't started. The cellar was quiet. I stood in the study, my hand on the phonograph, listening. Nothing. Why? The ledger. I grabbed the black, packed journal. September 4th, 1998. Clara is the chosen vessel. She is strong. She loves the music. The drone wasn't for the others. Not just for them. It was for her. The music, as Atticus's other log said, angers her. The music was a cage. A sonic cage to supplement the physical one. And the Sentinel. The mirror creature. It wasn't Atticus's partner. It was his jailer. It was the true keeper, and Atticus was just the maintenance man, tasked with keeping the vessel, Clara, contained and the others, the boglights, at bay. The fight last night, the Sentinel hadn't been fighting Clara. It had been hurting her. It had stepped out of the mirror because the salt line was broken. It was restoring order. I was the new maintenance man. I looked at the phonograph, then back toward the kitchen. The house was silent. She was quiet. Sated. I let my hand fall away from the phonograph. For tonight, I would let her sleep in silence. I was exhausted, caked in bog mud, sawdust, and goat hair. I found Atticus's liquor cabinet and poured a heavy glass of whiskey. I sat in the study, in the dark, and listened. The silence held for an hour. Then 2. It was just after midnight when I heard it. Thump. A single, soft, questioning knock from the kitchen. From my new plywood door. I sat frozen, the whiskey glass halfway to my lips. Thump, thump. Arthur. The small, wheedling voice of a child. It's dark, Arthur. I'm scared. Papa Atticus built me a door, but you built a wall. I didn't move. A pause. Then the sound changed. Scree. The sound of a single, massive claw dragging slowly across the new plywood, testing the grain, feeling for weakness. I know you're in there, Arthur, the small voice whispered, but it was different now, overlaid with a wet, guttural rattle. I can smell you. Scree. Thump. Thump. And I can smell him, the voice hissed. My blood stopped. I turned my head, looking through the study's open door, through the living room, to the shattered bay windows. The goat. I'd left it tied to the tree just outside. In the faint starlight, I could see its silhouette, its head raised, staring at the house. I'm hungry, Arthur, Clara's voice gurgled. And from the other side of my brand new, plywood and steel bolted door, I heard the heavy, unmistakable splintering of wood. The sound of splintering plywood was horrifyingly immediate. It wasn't the dull, wet thud of before, it was the sharp, violent crack of breaking timber. I threw my entire weight against the heavy sideboard, jamming it against my makeshift door. Escare crunch. A hole the size of a fist punched through the plywood, right at my eye level. Splinters exploded into the kitchen. Through the hole, I saw a flash of something wet and dark, and I smelled her, that overpowering, sweet, metallic stench. The sideboard shuddered as she slammed against it from the other side. Arthur. The voice was no longer a child's or a beast's. It was a guttural fusion of the two, roaring my name with a possessive, hungry rage. My barricade wouldn't hold for a minute. And the house was still silent. I'd forgotten the phonograph. I'd left the house in silence, and now the others would be coming. I was trapped between the unchained monster in my cellar and the spectral army in the bog. I had to choose. I took one last look at the plywood door, which was now bowing inward, a spiderweb of cracks forming from the hole. I bolted from the kitchen. I ran through the wrecked living room, ignoring the shattered windows and the slime-covered floor. The house was vibrating, but not from Clara. It was the low, pervasive hum of the bog, pressing in, sensing the silence, sensing the invitation. I reached the study and threw myself at the phonograph, cranking the handle with desperate, fumbling motions. The needle screeched as I dropped it. The drone of the cello filled the air. The reaction was instantaneous. From outside, the bog's humming retaliated, rising in volume to meet the music, a discordant, warring sound. The green lights I could see in the distance, through the broken windows, pulsed erratically. The music was holding them back, confusing them, just as the journal said. But from the kitchen, the sound was one of pure, unadulterated fury. Roar. The music was enraging her. A catastrophic crash of splintering wood and scraping furniture echoed from the kitchen. My pathetic barricade was gone. She was out. She was in the house. I backed against the study wall, my mind a blank wall of panic. The fire poker. It was all I had. I grabbed it, its heavy iron a pathetic weight in my shaking hand. The thudding began. But it wasn't in the kitchen. It was in the living room. Thud. 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 Heavy, deliberate, three-toed footsteps. She was stalking, moving from the kitchen into the main house. I could hear her sniffing the air, long, wet, gasping inhalations. Then, silence. I didn't breathe. The goat. I'd left it tied to the cypress tree just outside the study window. Huningri. The word was a wet gurgle, spoken from just outside the study's open door. She was right there. She had smelled the goat. The keeper provides. This was it. This was the job. I couldn't fight her. I couldn't hide from her. I had to feed her. It was the only way to pacify her. My eyes darted to the study window. The salt line was intact. But the goat was outside. Rule 4. Do not venture onto the bog after dark. I looked at the doorway, where a massive, hunched shadow was just beginning to block the light from the living room. To hell with the rules. With a strangled sob, I turned to the window. I used the butt of the fire poker to smash the glass, shattering the window and the salt line with it. The cold, humming air of the bog rushed in. I didn't hesitate. I threw one leg over the sill and tumbled out into the muddy, damp yard, landing hard on my hands and knees. I was outside. I was on their turf. The green lights of the others in the marsh, which had been held at bay by the music, now pulsed brightly. They sensed the broken barrier. They sensed me. Behind me, from inside the study, I heard a sound of pure, frustrated rage as Clara realized her meal was no longer just outside the window, but on the move. I scrambled to my feet. The goat was 20 yards away, tied to the tree, bleeding in pure, uncut terror. I ran for it. The ground was slick with bog mud. The humming of the others was a physical weight, pressing against my ears. I could hear them gliding through the trees, closer now. I reached the goat and fumbled with the knot on its rope. My fingers were numb and useless. A sound like a freight train crashing through the house behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The entire wall of the study exploded outward as Clara, in her full, monstrous, 7-foot-tall form, burst through the timber and plaster, landing on all fours on the muddy lawn, her emerald-green eyes locked directly on me. She roared, a sound of triumph and hunger, and charged. There was no time to think. There was only the roar, the smell of the cellar, and the impossible weight of the monster charging across the lawn. I was fumbling with the goat's rope, my fingers thick and useless. The knot was wet and tight. The goat itself was screaming, a high, piercing, continuous maaia, its eyes rolling white with terror. Clara was a blur of gray muscle and black mud. Her emerald eyes, the only part of her that was still human, were locked on me. I wasn't just a keeper. I was a transgression. I was the one who had built the wall. The others had formed a silent, glowing green coliseum around us, their orbs pulsing with a cold, expectant light. They were here for the show. I abandoned the knot. I couldn't free the goat. As Clara's claws tore up the last patch of grass between us, I did the only thing I could. I didn't run away from her, I ran at her, then dove, throwing myself sideways, using the last of my strength to roll behind the thick, ancient trunk of the cypress tree the goat was tethered to. Whomp! The impact shook the world. Clara, unable to pivot her massive charge, slammed shoulder first into the tree. The cypress groaned, and a shower of dead needles and bark rained down on me. The goat, tied to the same trunk, was jerked off its feet, its scream cut short in a choked gasp. I was on the other side of the tree, invisible, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. A new sound. A low, wet, furious growl. She wasn't wounded, she was annoyed. I heard her claws digging into the bark as she began to circle the trunk. She knew where I was. Scree! The goat, having found its breath, let out another terrified bleat. It was on the ground, tangled in its own rope, scrambling, helpless. Clara stopped. I heard her inhale, a long, wet, deep-throated sniff. I was on one side of the tree, covered in mud and terror. The goat was on the other, covered in mud and terror, and bleeding, a constant, ringing dinner bell of pure panic. She was a creature of primal, overwhelming hunger. Her rage at me was real, but the need to feed was absolute. She changed targets. I heard the heavy, three-toed thud as she moved. I didn't dare look. I just pressed my face into the rough bark, squeezing my eyes shut. The goat's bleeding was cut off. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, final, gurgling sound, followed by the sickening, heavy thud of the carcass being thrown to the ground. Then came the sounds. The sounds of tearing, of hide being ripped from muscle, of bones snapping like dry twigs. It was a wet, rhythmic, industrious sound. She was feeding. I stayed frozen against the tree for what felt like an eternity, my body rigid, listening to the sounds of my cousin, my vessel, having her meal. The humming from the others in the bog changed. The aggressive, discordant thrum softened, settling back into that low, steady, monotonous drone. They had been appeased. The ritual was complete. Slowly, the pale green lights began to recede. They drifted back from the house, one by one, a silent, retreating army, dissolving into the darkness of the marsh. After a long time, the wet, tearing sound stopped. I risked a peek. Clara's massive, hunched-over form was still there, her back to me. She was bent over the remains of the goat, unmoving. She was resting. Sated. Slowly, carefully, I pushed myself to my feet. My legs felt like jelly. I didn't dare breathe. I took one step backward, my boot squelching in the mud. Clara's head snapped around, her emerald eyes glowing in the dark, her entire face and chest slick with blood. We locked eyes. She didn't roar. She didn't charge. She just looked at me. And in those depths, I saw something beyond the monster. I saw a flicker of that 10-year-old girl, buried so deep she was almost gone. A flicker of recognition. Of shame. Then her head tilted, and the monster was back. She let out a low, rumbling growl, not of hunger, but of warning. This is my house. These are my grounds. You are here on my terms. She turned away from me, and with a heavy, unhurried, three-toed gait, she walked. Not to the study. She walked, with a terrible, possessive confidence, right back to the kitchen, to the gaping black maw of the cellar. She disappeared, one step at a time, down into the darkness, returning to her pool. I was alone in the yard. The phonograph's drone was the only sound left, a thin, mechanical cry in the sudden, awful silence. I stumbled back into the study through the shattered window, my entire body numb. I sank into Atticus's chair. I was the keeper. I had done the job. I looked at the phonograph, still spinning. I looked at the black salt I'd spilled on the floor. I looked at the ruined kitchen and the open cellar. This was my life now. I had to maintain the salt lines to keep the others out. I had to play the music to keep her sane, or contained. And every few days, I would have to go to a farm, buy a goat, and lead it to slaughter. My eyes fell on the black, packed journal. Atticus had written, "Clara is the chosen vessel. She is strong. She loves the music." But my gaze drifted to the other ledger, the one that tracked his feedings. His last entry, "I've failed. Clara. My Clara." She heard it. She heard her name from the bog. I told her not to answer. I wasn't fast enough. The water took her. My mind, numb with shock, suddenly saw the contradiction. One journal said Clara was chosen for the pool. The other said the water took her from the bog. Which one was the lie? And as I sat there, trying to piece together my great-uncle's horrifying, contradictory legacy, a new, terrible thought came to me. Atticus's log said, the goat was not enough. She knows the townsfolk are near. She can smell them. She prefers warm blood. I looked down at my own hands, caked in mud, scratched raw from the window. The goat had bought me time. But it was just a goat. I was a keeper. I was a Vance. I was here. How long until she decided she was tired of goats?